Good morning, everybody. I'm Carlo Barbante. I am the moderator of this webinar from CMCC and the SISC, which is entitled IPCC Special Report on Impacts of Global Warming of 1.5 degree, an overview of the main outcome. And we are dealing today basically with the IPCC report of 1.5 degree. I'm professor at the University of Venice. I'm a paleoclimatologist. I work since many years in climate, especially climate of the past, and I'm actually the president of the Italian Society for Climate Sciences, and together with the CMCC Foundation, we are hosting this important webinar from Professor Marco Bindi. So I welcome you all. We are now 141 attendees so far, but I think we will improve the number of participants in a very quickly. Let me first introduce very briefly the CMCC Foundation on the next slide. CMCC has a mission to investigate and model our climate system and interaction with society, and to provide reliable, rigorous, and timely scientific results, which in turn will simulate sustainable growth, protect the environment, develop science-driven adaptation and mitigation policies in a changing climate. This is the mission of the CMCC. And next slide, please. The CMCC is a foundation as is set up in Italy in 7 different places around the network in the country. Next, please. Is mainly dealing with several research divisions that you see here on advanced scientific computing, climate simulation and prediction, economic analysis, impact on agriculture, and so on and so forth. They are all interlinked. They participate in many European and international programs. Next, please. The main themes and topics are, of course, the modeling, policy and adaptation, prediction, impact, hydrogeology, forest simulation, ocean ecosystem, computing services. All that is very important. Then there is another very important part, which is the outreach, publication, events, education, communication, and it's basically what we are doing. What we are doing here today with this webinar. On this webinar, it is also very important, and I want to tell you that in your right side of the GoToMeeting application, you have a session for question in which you can pose question. Please, when you ask a question in written, please write your name and affiliation. Write a very brief question, and I will at the end of the webinar of Professor Marco Bindi, I will read and pose the question. Don't be afraid if your question will not be addressed to the presenter, because I'm sure there will be many. We are now at 170 participants to the webinar, but all the questions will be passed to Marco Bindi at the end, and so I hope he can answer in the coming days or weeks. So the topic is very relevant. I mean, we are going to discuss today the report on the special report on global warming of 1.5 degree that was approved in Incheon in Korea at the beginning of October. It has been a key scientific input into the Katowice Climate Change Conference in Poland, which has just been held. So we all are aware that limiting global warming to 1.5 degree would require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of societies, and this is a really important goal that we have to achieve in the coming years, very quickly. The report is very well written, but Marco will discuss about that. More than 6,000 scientific research references have been cited. There are more than 90 authors, and Marco is a lead author in the chapter 3. They are coming from 40 different countries, and certainly one of the key messages that I think we have to bring home is that we are already seeing consequences of 1 degree warming right now. So I think that we have to be sure that in the coming years we will be able to limit the warming better to 1.5 or 2 degree. That's the message that I think we have to pass to our policy makers in the future, and I think this this is what we are aiming for. Let me briefly to introduce the presenter of today. Marco Bindi is a professor at University of Florence. He has a PhD in crop simulation modeling of forage crops. He always worked since many years in research in the field of crop simulation. He led several national and interdisciplinary national and international interdisciplinary projects on agrometeorology. He was nominated lead author of the IPCC 4th and 5th assessment report, and as I told you, is also lead author of this 1.5 degree report. He's member of the European Society of Agronomy and the Italian Society of Agronomy. Has been director of the Department of Agronomy and Land Management of University of Florence. Is in many international committee, and as I told you, is what we will have today is first-hand news, since he participated as a lead author, especially on chapter 3 of the IPCC 1.5 report. All the presentation will be broadcasted also in YouTube in the coming days, and it will be available on the CMCC website. So I think I said everything I wanted, so be ready for question, and I will give the floor to Marco Bindi, and I'm thanking you, Marco, for accepting this very important seminar and webinar today. Thank you very much. I'll give you the floor.
Okay, thank you, Carlo, for your introduction. So as you said, in this in the next 30 minutes, I will try to give you an overview of the main outcomes of this special report on global warming of 1 degree. As Carlos said, you can find all the documentation in the IPCC webpage. Now I think that is ready the final version, so you can download, you can print. I give a quick look yesterday, and it seems a very good stylist organization, and so the report is ready to be downloaded. So I want just to go ahead in order to save time if it's possible. So first of all, I would like to say a few words about why we are speaking about 1.5 warming, and since we are speaking about 1.5 warming. So about when, definitely starting from the end of the 90s, it was clear from many of the studies on impacts of climate change that it should be necessary to keep under the 2 degrees warming the impact of climate change for the end of these centuries. You can see this in the slides related to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was the first time that we speak in an official document about that it will be necessary to limit it, in this case, below 2 degrees, the global warming. Then, of course, many other studies, definitely more detailed studies, demonstrated that probably a 2 degree warming was too much for our systems and ecosystems. So starting in this case from the beginning of these centuries, many of the research community stated that it wasn't necessary try to reduce the global warming to 1.5 by the end of the century. And if we are speaking about official document, you can see that the first official document was the Cancun Agreement in 2010, in which in the document you can find mention to limit global warming to 1.5. But of course was in 2015 in the conference of parties in Paris that this statement became more clear and more focused. And in particular, in the final report of the Paris Agreement, you can find three key messages. The first key message is that in some regions and vulnerable ecosystems, high risk are projected, even for warming above 1.5 degrees. The second key message is related to science, because as you can see, science on 1.5 warming is rather limited and less robust compared to other assessment for higher warmer increase. And the third key message is that about the efforts that all of us have to push to defense line low as possible. So these are the three key messages from the Paris Agreement that are strongly related to the 1.5 global warming. So on the basis of this agreement in Paris, the IPCC was invited to produce a special report. Usually, and we'll see later, usually IPCC produce an assessment report, one every 6 or 7 years, but also the IPCC can produce a special report, and this is the case. And so the UNCC asked the IPCC to produce this report. The IPCC accept to produce this report, but also the IPCC said that this report should be connected not only to climate change, but also to a sustainable development and also to an effort for eradicating poverty and inequity. So this is the reason, because at the end of the story, as you can see in the front page of the IPCC, of the special report, you can see a very, very long title, more than about 4 lines. So it's a very, very long title, because the IPCCs want to include all inside. Just a few numbers. Carlo mentioned some of these numbers, timeline and outline. So as Carlo said, more than 90 authors were involved, lead authors from 40 different countries. Then there are also contributing authors, more than 100 contributing authors, and also in terms of cited reference, more than 6,000 reference. And another very big issue is related to the 42,000 expert and government review comments. So in preparing the final report, from the first of the draft to the final document, as you can see, we received more than 42,000 review comments. That it's a lot, I can guarantee. About the outline, you know, the special report is organized in 5 chapters. You can see here the list of the chapter. We come back later, so it's not really necessary to spend so much time on this. However, the first chapter is mainly related to the defining where we are, in order to understand how far we are from 1.5 warming. The second chapter is mainly related to mitigation pathways, so how we can approach and how we can address this warming using the appropriate and the sustainable mitigation pathways. Then chapter 3 is, as Carlo said, I was involved in this chapter, and the aim of this chapter is on impact. So the chapter is focused on evaluating the impact related to 1.5 global warming, but also is focused on give some information about the difference between the impacts from 1.5 and 2 degree warming, because this is also a crucial and important statement. Chapter 4, that is mainly related to strategies, mitigation and adaptation strategies that we can adapt to address this threshold. And finally, there is the fifth chapter, chapter 5, that is mainly related to the link between climate change, sustainable development, poverty eradication, and reducing inequities. Just a few words about the timeline, because I believe that this was my first time in a special issue. Previously, I was involved in an assessment issue. Usually, the work lasted about 3 years. In this case, from the beginning to the end, it was about 1.5 years. It was really a tough work, very compressed in time. So it was a nice experience, but it was really a tough experience because, as I said before, you have to produce several draft documents and then the final one to answer to many review comments and so on. So now we move to the report. And when I prepare my presentation, the idea was to start from the end of the report, and in particular in these slides and the next slides, you will see the main key messages from the press release. As Carlo said, the press release was the 8th of October in Korea, and so in these slides and the next slides, you will find some of the main statement from very important people in the special report. You can see here, for example, a co-chair of Working Group 1, a co-chair of Working Group 2, and so on. So relevant people involved in this special report. So in the first page, you can find 3 statements. If we want to classify in some way, compare especially with the statements that you can find in the next slide, probably these are the negative key messages, and probably in the next slide we'll see some more positive messages. And the first messages, you can see we are already seeing the consequence of 1 point global warming. This is what Carlo anticipated. So we are dealing with the climate change. We can see the consequence of 1 degree, so we are not really so far from 1.5, but as we'll see in a minute, there will be some difference from the present situation, the future situation with 1.5. However, we already seen consequence. The second key message is that every extra bit of warming increases the risk associated with the long-lasting and irreversible changes. So it's important to take in account that if we address 1.5, this probably could be sustainable for our system. If we are not able to address this increase, probably or definitely higher increases in the risk will be associated. And in some cases, this will be associated with irreversible changes. The third statement is that related how important it is to take a decision. So as you can see, decisions we are made today are critical in ensuring a safe and sustainable world for everyone. And the second statement is that the next few years are probably the most important in our history. So it's definitely important to understand. This is not easy to understand from the scientific community. It's more difficult to understand this statement for policymakers, that we have to take a decision. These decisions are critical. These decisions are fundamental for our future. And probably the next years will be very, very important for our history, for our present, but especially for our future. So I moved to the, as I said before, to the more positive key messages. And in particular, here you can find 4 messages. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, but doing so would require unprecedented changes. So it's clear that it's possible from a chemistry point of view and from a physics point of view, but it's necessary to make unprecedented changes. So it's necessary to do something. We cannot really wait, as I said before. Then the second statement is that limiting warming to 1.5 would reduce challenges impact on ecosystem and human health, and this also making it easier to achieve the UN SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we'll be able to address this global warming, this would be good for our ecosystems, but this is good also for our sustainable development too. Then the third statement is related to the action. So it's necessary to take into account that some action are already underway. So we are already doing something, but the problem is that we need to accelerate what we are doing. So it's not really enough, and we come back later on this point. The final statement probably is the most important statement, especially for the policymaker. And this report gives policymakers and practitioners the information they need to make decisions. And we'll come back later at the end of the presentation. I have one slide about a few comments on the conference of the parties in Katowice that just finished last week, about how difficult it is to pass from a scientific point of view to a policymaker point of view. However, so now we move to the chapter. So how we can arrive to these key messages, and in particular, in each of the 5 chapters, we try to give an answer to key questions. And here you can see the main key question for each of the 5 chapters. I don't want to go in detail now because we come back just in a second in the next slides on each of the main question and about giving an address to each of these key messages. So starting from chapter 1, that, as I said before, is mainly related to define where we are. And in fact, as you can see, the question is how close are we, to 1.5 warming degree. And what is clear from the report that is, and also, as I said before, human-induced warming has already reached 1 degree above the pre-industrial. So we are very, very close to 1.5. There is not so much space, not so much room from now and 1.5. The other important statement is that if the current warming rate continues, and we know that this is about 0.2 degrees per decade, the world would reach a human-induced global warming, not at the end of the century, but in 2040, so in about 20 years. So it's necessary to reduce the current warming rate. Otherwise, as I said, has just said, we reach this threshold in a few years and not at the end of the century. Then other 2 important statements are related. The first one is that since the 70s, so since 40 years ago, most land regions have been warming faster than the global average. So the land region have been warming faster. than the global average. So in many regions has already exceeded 1.5 above pre-industrial level. And you can see rather clearly in the map that is on the right bottom, where, of course, the warming in the global warming compared to the pre-industrial is reported. And you can see from the color that in many cases we are above the 1 point of the 1 average warming, and also in many cases we are above the 1.5 degree. And also related to this, it's necessary to consider that a fifth of the global population live in regions that have already experienced warming at least one season that is greater than 1.5. So in many places, and as I said, 1/5 of the global population had already experienced weather increase similar to what we would like to have for the end of the century. So this is the present situation. Now we move to chapter 2 to give an idea which kind of pathway, which kind of greenhouse gases pathway we can have for reach this threshold for the end of the century. And the question, in fact, is what kind of pathways limit warming to 1.5 degree? And we are on a track, because this is the other important point. The first point is to define a pathway to reach this threshold, and the other very important point is to know if we are now on the track or if we are really far from this. And as you can see from the three statements that you have in these slides, there is no definitive way to limit global warming rise to 1.5 above the pre-industrial. So it's not really possible, sustainable to limit the increase lower than 1.5. So this is another important point. Then, of course, about the pathway for reaching this equilibrium at 1.5 degrees could be different. And here in these slides, you can see two examples. One example is without what we call overshooting. So we stabilize global temperature at 1.5. You can see this in the graphics on the right, on the upper right. Or the other possibility is that we can have a different pathway with what we call overshooting. In this case, as you can see, in the short time we pass 1.5, we will reach higher temperature, and then we come back to the equilibrium at 1.5. And this is rather crucial. We'll see later when we speak about the impact. There are big difference, or rather large difference, if we address this equilibrium without overshooting or with overshooting. The other very important point, because there was a lot of discussion about the Paris Agreement, but as you can see here in this statement, countries pledges agreed in Paris to reduce their emission are currently not in line with limiting global warming. So it is necessary not only to define how to declare, how to control, and so on, the reduction in terms of emission, but it's also necessary to enhance this reduction in the mitigation in the emission strategies. This is another important point. So it's not sufficient. We are not really on track. It is necessary to do much more in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases emission. Still remaining to chapter 2, the other question is related to what do energy supply and demand have to do with limiting global warming to 1.5. This is, of course, if we want to reduce the emission, it's necessary to do something in terms of energy supply, it's necessary to do something in terms of energy demand. And then, of course, we have a third option that is we can do something in terms of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. But if we focus on energy supply and energy demand, on energy supply, as you can see, it's rather clear that we need to have a major reduction in greenhouse gases from all the different sectors. So it's not only possible to focus on only in a few sectors. This is because it's not sufficient, and it's also because the different sectors are not independent. They are related to each other. So it's really fundamental to work in an holistic way. So to address the problem from every angles and from all the different sectors. This is in terms of energy supply. In terms of energy demand, also this is a crucial point, because we have to reduce the emission in terms of supply, but it's also necessary to reduce the emission in terms of energy demand. And in this case, how we can do this? Improving energy efficiency in many different sectors, but also reducing consumption. This is a fundamental point. We need also, for reducing energy demand, reducing consumption. And of course, we know that if you want to reduce consumption, it's necessary to change behavior or lifestyle. So behavior and lifestyle changes are necessary if really we want to reduce consumption. So as you can see, there is a final statement, demand and supply measurement have to work in parallel. So it's necessary to work on both energy supply and energy demand. And only if we work in parallel and we try to reduce as much as possible trade-off and to focus on synergy. So only in this case we can have also strong effect in terms of the option for reducing CO2 emission. But the problem of reducing CO2 emission, it's a rather complex problem. It's not very easy to have an idea how we'll be able to do that. So what the report suggests is much better to focus on energy supply and demand, and then of course to have a third option in terms of reducing also the emission. So we move to chapter 3. As I said before, chapter 3 was on impact. So we study impact on all the different ecosystems, all the different economic systems. And in particular, in this chapter, we focus not only in evaluating the impact for a global warming of 1.5, but also the difference between the impact if we'll have a 1.5 global warming or a 2-degree global warming. There are many results. It's not very easy to summarize in a few slides, or just in this case in one slide. However, here you can find some statement, and also you can find a graphics in which we try to summarize how is important to limit the global warming to 1.4, because of course also in terms of impact there are differences. In some sector, in some ecosystem, the differences between the impact of 1.5 global warming and 2 degree global warming is not really so big, but in other cases the difference are really dramatic. So in some cases the risk it could be lower, and then if we are not able to address 1.5, the risk will become very high. So if I try to summarize something about impact, so as you can see, one, of course, it's an obvious statement. Impact of climate change are not spread uniformly across the globe. So it's necessary to take in account that impact is so different if we move from north to south, from valley to a mountain, and so on. And so this determines that different parts of the world have a different experience in terms of impact. The other important point is that even if the warming compared to the present time, it's very limited, an average warming of 1.5 across the whole globe raises the risk of potential impact. So it's necessary to take in account that even if we'll be able to reach this threshold by the end of the century or before the end of the century, there will be difference from now. So risk of impact will increase even if we reach this threshold. But what is important, that the risk will be lower in general, and in some cases the risk will be much lower if we reach 1.5 instead of, or rather than 2 warming. So this is another important point. The other important point is how we reach this threshold, this equilibrium. And as we said before, there are big differences in terms of the impact. If we reach this equilibrium without overshooting, or if we reach with overshooting. So it's clear that if we reach without overshooting, the impact will be lower. If we reach this equilibrium with overshooting, the impact will be definitely higher. So this is another important point. But however, you have the report to see all the different impact on different sectors. So we move to chapter 4. What transition could be? Chapter 4 is related, as I said at the beginning, to which kind of mitigation and adaptation strategies will need to address 1.5 warming. And so the question is, what transition could be enabled limiting global warming to 1.5? And it's clear from this fourth statement that, as you can see, world would need to transform in a number of complex and connected ways. So transformation, it will be necessary. The transition toward the lower greenhouse emissions are already underway. This is true. There are in many cities, in many regions, countries, business and community. But the other statement is that there are a few that are currently consistent with a limiting warming to 1.5. As I said before, we are doing something, but this is not enough. Another statement is related to this point. Meeting this challenge would require a rapid escalation in the current scale and pace of change, and particularly in the coming decades. So this is to reinforce the previous statement. We have to do something, but we have to do better, we have to do much more, and we have to do faster. And then, of course, in terms of what we can do, both as mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies, it's necessary to take into account carefully many different factors. So it's necessary to take into account how these are feasible in terms of environment, how these are feasible in terms of technology, economy, social and cultural aspect, institutional and physical. So when we want to take into account mitigation and adaptation strategies, it's necessary to take into account all these factors and their feasibility. So still remaining to chapter 4, another part of chapter 4 is focused on how the adaptation is important for reaching this threshold. Because very often people, when think about 1 warming degree, is immediately thinking about mainly to mitigation strategies that are fundamental, as I said, up to now. But also adaptation strategies are still important. Because as I said before, the risk in terms of impact will increase even if we address 1.5 warming degree. So it's not possible to forget, it's not possible to focus only on mitigation. It's necessary to combine mitigation and adaptation and try to find as much possible synergy between mitigation and adaptation strategies. And here you can see 4 statements related to this question. So, and the first one is this is important because, as we said before, climate change will be different in different places of the world, and also, so in this case, people in different regions are adapting in a different way. It's not possible to have the same way of adapting everywhere. So it's necessary to understand the impact and then to understand how to adapt in a different way in a different part of the world for many different reasons. The other important point is that a rise of global warming from the present time, to 1.5 degrees and beyond increases the need of adaptation. So it's necessary to take into account that will increase adaptation. It's not sufficient to what we are doing now. But another very important point is that adaptation needs will be smaller if we reach 1.5 warming instead of 2 degree warming. Also still about adaptation is more or less the same as for mitigation. Many adaptation strategy has already adapted in many places of the world, but we are really at the beginning. These adaptation strategies are not evenly distributed globally, so it's necessary to improve in terms of adaptation strategies and also how these are distributed and organized all over the world. Another point, as I mentioned before, that adaptation measures are not sufficient by themselves. So it's necessary to take into account adaptation and mitigation strategy, as I said before. So we are moving to the end of my presentation, to chapter 5. As I said before, chapter 5 is mainly focused on how we can link climate change issue for addressing warming to 1.5 degree and the sustainable development and a reduction in poverty and inequity. So, as you can see here, the main question, or one of the main questions in this chapter, is what are the connections between sustainable development and limiting global warming to 1.5? And in this case, I try to summarize in 4 main statements. And the first one is that the first two are each other related. The climate change affects the ability to achieve sustainable development. So it's clear that climate change has some effect on sustainable development. At the same time, pursuing sustainable development will influence emission impact and vulnerable. So there are relationship each other. So it's necessary to find a good agreement. And in particular, what is very important in the third statement, the response to climate change in the form of adaptation and mitigation will also interact with sustainable development with positive effects. So it's necessary to focus on positive effects. So it's necessary to focus on synergy and avoiding, of course, trade-off. So as you can see in the last statement, the response to climate change can be planned to maximize synergy and to limit trade-off with sustainable development. Here there is one of the table of the report. It's there are a lot of information in this table, and maybe it's not very easy to understand, but for each of the sustainable development goals, there are which kind of synergy we could have in terms of energy supply, in terms of energy demand, and in terms of land. And you can see which kind of trade-off and synergy. If you just look at the dimension of the column, you can realize that there are more possibilities to have synergies than trade-off, but it's necessary to take into account that trade-off should be avoided as much as possible. Still remaining on the relationship to climate change and poverty reduction and reducing inequities. Also here you can find 4 statements related to this, in which the pathway, so how we can approach for relating climate change and poverty and inequity will be different between and within region and nation. So this is a clear message. It's not really possible to have the same solution for any places, any people. This is related, of course, because development progress today has been uneven, and climate-related risks are unevenly distributed, as we said before. So flexible, as you can see, governance would be needed. So it's necessary, definitely, to be flexible. It's not really possible, as I said before, to find a solution. But there are solutions. And here there is an example of what we call a climate-resilient development pathway. As you can see, offers a possibility to achieve both inequity and low carbon features. So we have possibility to put together and to take into account all the three different issues: climate change, poverty, and inequity, and try to address what we can reach by the end of this century. Next steps. We are close to the end of my presentation. So as I said before, usually the IPCC produces a special report and assessment report. We are now in the 6th assessment cycle. As you can see that for this cycle, 3 special reports are planned. One is the report about we are speaking, global warming of 1.5 degrees. Then there is another one, ocean and cryosphere in a change in climate, and the last one that is climate change and land. These 2 special reports will be finishing in the next year. And then, of course, there is the assessment report. The assessment report, the 6th assessment report, has already started, and as you can see, finish in about 4 years from now. And then, of course, as a next steps of the special report, there was the conference of parties. You remember at the beginnings we said that these issues started in the Cancun Agreement and then in the Paris Agreement. And as I said before, we just finished the conference of parties in Katowice at the beginning of December. And I was not there, so I don't have many details, but I give a quick look in many documents, news, and so on. And it was interesting a news reported in the website Clima Alterati, in which you can see that there was a discussion about how to take in account from a policy point of view the special report. In particular, the discussion was here in the subsidiary body of Science and Technology Advice. This is a body that is very important in the conference of parties because determines and manage the relationship between the scientific community and the policy community. And as you can see from the discussion in this body was to a text that was proposed, and here you can see a part of this text. And I have underlined a few words, and in particular the words noted or note, because the big discussion during the conference and in this part of the conference was to a request of replacing noted with welcome. It seems nothing, but this is a big difference because, of course, if you just mention noted, you take note and then you can decide also in a different way. If you welcome, of course, in this case, you have more restriction. And at the end of the story, unfortunately, this change was not approved after a long discussion. And because usually, as you know, in this kind of conference, there should be a complete agreement. So, and they were not able to find an agreement. So this is just to give you an idea that sometimes it's very difficult to pass from a scientific point of view to a political point of view. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marco. We really welcome, as a scientific community and as a here in the audience, we really welcome this report and all the effort you and other colleagues have done in bringing things together. It's certainly true that we need to combine adaptation and mitigation. We see that it's possible. All that we have to act very, very, very soon, I think. So it's all in our shoulder. We have to convey the message to our policymakers, and I think is the time to do. So thank you very much for your very nice and clear presentation. I have a bunch of questions here, and I would like to go through some of them. But I want to remind you all that the question will be passed to the presenter, to Marco Bindi, and there will be an answer, most hopefully very, very soon. So one of the questions that I have several on this topic. I mean, on specific region and not. What's the impact on mountain region, if you can answer, Marco, on that? The impact of this 1.5 or even 2 degree on mountain region, because we heard about the water, we heard about the energy, but what about the mountain region?
Yeah, from what I can say, this is not only as a result of this special issue. This is a result from also previous assessment report that mountain region are very sensitive to climate change, probably more than many other part of the world. And the other the other issue is that in many cases, the increase in temperature in mountain region is higher very often to the average increase in temperature. So this is my perception more than my really knowledge or skills, because I'm not really an expert on this, that this environment, this ecosystem, or this system, as we address in economic way or now or in an environmental way, is already very sensitive. We notice every day, we notice every season, and probably will be more and more sensitive in the future. And even if we'll address the 1.5 warming degree, that it's a big result. It's necessary to take in account this, because now we are speaking about this, but to reach this, it's not really a joke. It's really a big issue. I believe that special attention should be given to the mountain ecosystems for many reasons, for environmental reasons, for economic reasons, for many, and for social reasons. So there are many things that we have to take in account.
Thank you very much, Marco. There is another question from Juan Acosta Navarro. He's from BSc in Spain, and Juan asks, I would like to ask the speaker what he think about the criticism received by the IPCC 1.5 report from some important scientists that think that the report is perhaps too optimistic because little emphasis on Earthism feedback was made. It means that there is a non-zero probability of crossing important threshold of climate. So, yeah.
Okay. This is my opinion. Probably it seems that we are in some way too optimistic. Probably this is true, but this is not really probably mainly related to the scientific point of view. So from the scientific point of view, as I said before, there are all the chemistry possibility or the physics possibility to address this limit. The problem is, as I said before, when we pass from a scientific point of view to a political point of view. So I believe that my troubles are mainly related to, so if we want to have really a scientific report, it's necessary to avoid what could happen at political level. Otherwise, the risk is that very often when I was involved in the IPCC report, I discussed it with other people, and they said, okay, the document, the final document, especially the summary for policymaker, is a more political document than a scientific document. So from my point of view, in a special report like this, it's necessary to report what we can do. Then if we'll be able to do that, this is another story. So from my point of view, it's not a question to be too much positive or too much negative. It's a question to report what the results of the studies describe. Of course, there are always people that are thinking in a different way. But
yeah, I selected a very last question on technology. This is coming from Maya Daniel, and thanks Maya for that. And the question is, can you speak to the role of technology as a lever for adaptation? How important is that we pay attention to it now that the report has stressed the need for adaptation? So the role of technology and all that.
Definitely, as I said before, probably because my field of interest is more related to adaptation than to mitigation, that definitely technology are fundamental. So, for example, I give you just, I would like to say just a few words about my sector. As you mentioned before, I'm interested on agriculture. So if I'm thinking about smart agriculture, so technology are fundamental. So for agriculture, both in terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation. So definitely, and this is the reason because many countries, and not just the European countries, but also China, are pushing a lot of new technologies and on technology for addressing the problem of climate change. So from my point of view, technologies are fundamental, and the new technology in particular are fundamental for all the different sectors and fields. I made an example for agriculture because I know much better this, but if we want to have a future for agriculture, it will be necessary to give the right space to technologies, to new technologies, in order to reduce the impact of agriculture and in order to make adaptable much better than the present time.
Okay, Marco, I think it's time to close. We passed the time. We have been consistently over 200 attendees, which is a great success, I would say. So thank you, Marco, very much for your very simple and clear presentation. Can you pass to the next slide? Because I want to tell everybody that we have another seminar, another webinar on next Friday, 21st of December from 11 to 12:30. That will be in Italian. It's again co-organized by CMCC and SISC, and it will deal with the Katowice COP24. So what came out, and Marco just told us a little bit about that. So let me remind you on the next slide that everything has been recorded, so you can look at the channel or YouTube channel or on the website of CMCC. And if you do have any further question about the webinar, please contact the webinar at cmcc.it. Let me thank you, all of you, for participating. There were, as I told you, consistently more than 200 people participating, 30 questions asked, and sorry, we just took 3 of them. I thought the most representative, but you can we will pass all them to the presenter. So thank you very much again, and hope to see you on the next webinar on Friday this week. Bye bye.
Okay,
thank you very much.
To everybody.
And grazie Marco again. Thank you.
Okay, bye bye. Thank you to everybody. Bye. Have a nice Christmas time.